At my brother's engagement party, he humiliated me in front of hundreds of wealthy guests, screaming that I was faking my paralysis for sympathy. Then he grabbed my arm and dragged me out of my wheelchair, throwing me onto the cold marble floor. My father called me the family's biggest failure, while my mother looked away in absolute disgust and apologized for my drama. They had no idea I had just tapped a panic button on my wrist. 15 minutes later, 6 uniformed officers marched through the grand doors, and my family's perfect image shattered into a million pieces. My name is Tessa. I am 33 years old, and I work as a forensic accountant. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to survive a toxic family who tried to bury your truth. The Crystal Room at the Oakwood Country Club was a sea of glittering chandeliers, expensive champagne, and forced smiles. It was the engagement party of the decade, celebrating my older brother Cameron and his wealthy fiancée, Sophie. I sat quietly in the corner in my custom wheelchair, wearing a dark emerald dress, trying to remain as invisible as possible. The music swelled over the chatter of 200 guests, all dressed in designer evening wear. The catering staff moved silently between the round tables, carrying trays of hors d'oeuvres that cost more than my first car. Harrison, my father, had spent the entire evening shaking hands and boasting about his logistics company. Linda, my mother, was floating between tables, ensuring every napkin was perfectly aligned and every guest knew how brilliant her son was. What they did not know was that I had spent the last 5 years building a highly successful forensic accounting firm. I tracked hidden assets for international banks and had quietly amassed a multi-million-dollar net worth. I kept my wealth entirely hidden from them because I knew exactly how greedy and manipulative they could be. I only attended this party to maintain the illusion of compliance while I finalized my long-term plans. I watched from my shadowy corner as the hired photographer set up his equipment near the massive floral archway. Cameron was holding court under the bright lights. He was heavily intoxicated, his face flushed, holding a crystal glass of scotch that kept spilling over the edges. He was posing for professional photographs with Sophie and her elite parents. The photographer kept adjusting the angles, trying to get the entire room in the background, but my corner kept creeping into the frame. That was when Cameron's eyes locked onto me. I could see the immediate shift in his posture. The charming golden boy vanished, replaced by the angry, entitled man I knew too well. His heavy footsteps echoed slightly above the music as he marched toward me. He stood over me, his breath smelling strongly of liquor and entitlement. He leaned down, gripping the armrests of my wheelchair so tightly his knuckles turned white. "You are ruining the background," he sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "Can you not just park yourself in the hallway out of sight?" I looked up at him, refusing to shrink away. I told him I was sitting exactly where our mother had assigned me, and I was not going to hide in a corridor like a stray dog. His face twisted with fury. "You are just milking this minor injury for 5 years," he hissed so loudly that nearby guests stopped talking and turned to stare. "You just want everyone to look at you and pity you. You are faking it to steal my spotlight, just like you always try to do." I stared back at him, feeling the familiar sting of his gaslighting. 5 years ago, my life changed forever in a horrific car crash, and he had the nerve to call it a minor injury. I told him to step back and lower his voice. "I am not moving, Cameron," I said calmly. "Get up," he demanded, his voice echoing across the silent room. "Get up and walk out of here right now." Before I could even process his threat, his large hands clamped around my upper arm. The grip was bruising and violent. With a sudden jerk, he yanked me forward. My body, lacking the lower body strength to resist or balance, was pulled completely out of the seat. The world tilted sideways. I crashed hard onto the polished marble floor. A collective gasp echoed through the massive ballroom. The music seemed to fade away entirely, leaving only the sound of my ragged breathing and the clatter of my legs hitting the stone. I lay on the cold marble, waiting for anyone to intervene. Surely a room full of 200 people would offer some assistance. But then I saw my father Harrison striding across the room. He did not kneel beside me. He did not ask if I was hurt. He stepped right past my fallen body and put a reassuring hand on Cameron's shoulder. Harrison turned to the shocked crowd and scoffed loudly. "Please, everyone go back to your drinks," my father announced, waving his hand dismissively. "Ignore the family's biggest failure. She has always been incredibly jealous of her brother. She is just putting on a show to ruin his special night." I looked up, searching for my mother Linda, hoping for a shred of maternal instinct. She was already rushing over to Sophie's parents. "I am so incredibly sorry for this attention-seeking drama," Linda pleaded with the wealthy couple, her voice laced with manufactured embarrassment. "Tessa has always struggled with reality since her accident. Please do not let her ruin this beautiful evening for Cameron and Sophie." Not a single guest moved to help me. The wealthy elite of the city simply stared, whispering behind their champagne flutes, fully believing the narrative my powerful father had just spun. They saw a bitter, disabled woman trying to ruin a perfect party. I did not cry. I did not scream for help. 5 years of emotional abuse and isolation had burned all the tears out of me. Instead, I calmly rolled onto my side. I slid my right hand over my left wrist. My smartwatch was hidden beneath the long lace sleeve of my emerald dress. I tapped a specific pre-programmed sequence on the screen. 3 quick taps, a brief pause, and 1 long press. It was a direct distress signal linked to the private security firm I retained and the local police precinct. A small vibration against my wrist confirmed the signal had been received and units were dispatched. I slowly pulled myself up using the heavy metal base of my overturned wheelchair. My arms trembled from the immense physical effort, but I refused to ask for help from the people staring at me. Cameron was laughing now, adjusting his suit jacket, reveling in the approval of our father, and the sympathetic looks from Sophie's family. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully humiliated me, proven their absolute control, and established the narrative they wanted. I managed to right my chair and pull myself back into the seat. I sat silently in my corner, smoothing my dress, waiting for the clock to tick down. I checked the time on my watch, knowing that my retaliation was already in motion. Every second that passed brought them closer to the destruction they had earned. 15 minutes later, the heavy brass doors of the country club ballroom burst open. 6 uniformed police officers marched into the ballroom, their expressions deadly serious, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, murmuring in confusion. He walked confidently toward the officers, reaching into the inner pocket of his tailored suit and pulling out his thick leather wallet. "Officers, there is no problem here at all," Cameron said smoothly. "Just a minor family misunderstanding that got a bit loud. Let me take care of your trouble for the night." The lead officer did not even look at the cash. He bypassed the money completely, stepped around Cameron's outstretched hand, and pulled out a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. "Cameron," the officer stated in a voice that carried across the dead silent room, "we received a direct report of aggravated assault and we have the entire incident captured on the venue's security cameras. Put your hands behind your back." As the metallic click of the handcuffs echoed through the room, Harrison rushed forward, his face purple with rage. He leaned down to my wheelchair, his eyes filled with absolute venom, and hissed, "You are dead to us. We will ruin you and evict you from your apartment by morning." I smiled, looking up at the man who had tormented me for years, and replied, "I would love to see you try to evict the landlord." The glaring fluorescent lights of the downtown precinct buzzed with a low, irritating hum that mirrored the suffocating tension filling the room. I sat perfectly still in my custom wheelchair near the corner of the main detective desk area, watching the chaotic spectacle unfold before my eyes. Cameron was pacing furiously inside a temporary holding cell behind reinforced safety glass. His expensive tailored suit was hopelessly wrinkled, and his drunken arrogance was finally cracking under the harsh reality of metal bars. The heavy double doors of the precinct suddenly swung open with tremendous force. My father Harrison stormed inside angrily. He walked into the room like he owned the entire city block. My mother Linda followed closely behind him, clutching her designer handbag tightly, like a protective shield against the grim reality of a police station. Flanking them were three men wearing immaculate gray suits. They were the high-priced corporate defense lawyers Harrison kept on an astronomical retainer for situations exactly like this one. "Where is the commanding officer?" Harrison demanded loudly, his deep voice booming across the busy room. "My son is being held on utterly ridiculous charges, and I want him released into my custody immediately today." Detective Miller, a seasoned officer with sharp evaluating eyes, stepped out from behind his cluttered desk. He held up a metal clipboard containing the initial incident report. "Your son committed a documented physical assault in front of over 100 wealthy witnesses," Mr. Caldwell, the detective, stated flatly. "He grabbed a disabled woman and violently threw her to the ground without any provocation. That is not a minor family misunderstanding. That is a felony." Linda gasped loudly, pressing a manicured hand to her chest. She pointed a trembling finger directly at me across the room. "She is not disabled, officer. She is a manipulative liar who wants to destroy her brother out of pure spite," Linda declared loudly. Harrison stepped forward smoothly, pulling a thick manila envelope from his leather briefcase. He slid it across the wooden desk with a highly patronizing smile. "Detective, you are being played by a very sick young woman. Inside this envelope, you will find my daughter and her official medical records. They clearly state that Tessa suffers from a severe case of hysterical psychosomatic paralysis. She convinced herself she cannot walk because she craves constant attention from our family. She is completely delusional here. Cameron was just trying to help her stand up to prove she has been faking it to everyone," Harrison continued. "I watched my father lie with the effortless grace of a seasoned predator. He was actually trying to gaslight the entire police department, attempting to overwrite my physical reality using his money and corporate influence, just as he had done for my entire adult life." Detective Miller frowned deeply, opening the envelope and pulling out the thick stack of documents. They looked incredibly official, complete with legitimate hospital letterheads and physician signatures. For a brief second, I saw real doubt. I saw the doubt cross the detective and his seasoned face. The gaslighting was actually working. Before the detective could speak another word, the heavy precinct doors opened again. Bennett, my personal attorney, walked into the room with the calm, terrifying presence of a man who held absolutely all the winning cards. He did not look at my parents or their expensive legal team. He walked straight to the detective desk and placed a heavy leather-bound dossier directly on top of Harrison and his fake medical documents. "Good evening," Detective Miller Bennett said smoothly. "I am representing Tessa Caldwell. I would strongly advise you to handle those documents Mr. Caldwell just handed you with extreme care. You are now holding physical evidence of criminal fraud." Harrison's face turned a mottled shade of angry red. "Who the hell do you think you are?" he shouted. "Those are confidential family medical files." Bennett ignored him completely, tapping the heavy dossier he had brought. "In this certified time-stamped medical file retrieved directly from the State Medical Board just an hour ago, you will find the authentic MRI scans and surgical reports regarding my client. They categorically prove irreversible spinal cord damage." "This damage was sustained exactly 5 years ago," Bennett stated firmly. Furthermore, Bennett turned his piercing gaze to my father. "The document Mr. Caldwell just provided features a blatantly forged signature of a doctor who lost his medical license over 3 years ago." The air in the precinct grew incredibly heavy. My mother stumbled back a step, her hand dropping from her chest in shock. The high-priced corporate lawyers Harrison had brought suddenly looked extremely uncomfortable, shifting their weight and whispering frantically among themselves. They understood the severe legal implications of submitting forged documents directly to a police officer. Harrison completely lost his mind. His carefully maintained corporate facade shattered entirely right there in the lobby. He lunged forward, pointing a shaking, angry finger directly at my face. "You drove your own car into a ditch 5 years ago because you were mentally unstable," he screamed. "You crashed that car. You ruined your own legs, and you have been blaming this family ever since. You are a sick, twisted girl." The entire precinct fell dead silent. Officers at neighboring desks stopped typing on their keyboards. The ugly confession of our deep family toxicity hung in the cold air today. Harrison was breathing heavily, his chest heaving up and down, believing his loud, aggressive dominance would somehow rewrite the truth right there in the police station. I slowly rolled my wheelchair forward, closing the distance between us until I was just inches away from the wooden detective desk. I did not raise my voice at all. I did not show a single ounce of the fear they had conditioned me to feel for decades. Detective Miller, I said, my voice steady and crystal clear in the quiet room. My father brings up a very interesting point about that fateful night. He brings up the night I was permanently paralyzed. I was told it was a simple single car accident. But considering the extreme lengths my family is willing to go to forge official medical documents today, I believe the hit-and-run investigation from 5 years ago might need a rigorous secondary review. Harrison's face instantly drained of all its color. The angry red flush completely vanished, leaving him sickly pale and visibly trembling. He looked over at Linda, who was now staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. The sudden mention of the crash had hit a deep nerve. The mention of a hit and run had hit a nerve so deep, they were both physically shaking. Detective Miller picked up his silver pen. His eyes darted from the forged medical document to my authentic dossier, and finally rested on my father and his sweating face. "I think that is an excellent idea," Tessa, the detective, said thoughtfully. "We take medical fraud very seriously, and we absolutely never close a vehicular assault case when new compelling evidence presents itself." Bennett handed the lead detective his premium business card. "We will be submitting a formal legal request for the reopening. We will request the reopening of the case tomorrow morning," Bennett declared. "For now, we expect Cameron Caldwell to face the maximum possible charges for tonight and his unprovoked, violent assault." Harrison and his corporate lawyers immediately began pulling him toward the exit doors, whispering frantically that they needed to leave before Harrison said anything else that could easily be used against him in a court of law. The situation had completely spiraled out of their control. They came to successfully bully the police and rescue their precious golden boy, but they were leaving with massive evidence of criminal fraud. They were leaving with evidence of fraud hanging over their heads, and the dark shadow of a 5-year-old crime suddenly brought back into the bright light. Before allowing his lawyers to drag him through the double doors, Harrison violently tore himself free from their grip. He marched back over to me, leaning down aggressively over my wheelchair. I could smell the expensive scotch on his breath mixed with the sharp, bitter scent of raw panic. He was no longer the confident, wealthy patriarch. He was a desperate man losing his tight grip on the false narrative he loved. He had spent a massive fortune to control this story. "You are absolutely dead to us," Harrison hissed, his voice trembling with venomous rage. "You think you have won because you got your brother locked up for one night. You think you are so smart. You are nothing. You have relied completely on my generous charity your entire life. I will cut you off completely. I will have you evicted from your condo by sunrise tomorrow. You will be on the street where you belong." He turned and stormed out, leaving me smiling in my chair, ready for tomorrow morning. The ride back to my downtown condo was quiet, insulated from the chaos of the police precinct by the thick glass of my modified accessibility van. The city lights of the skyline blurred past my window, reflecting the cold, hard reality of what had just transpired. My family had finally shown their true colors in a room full of law enforcement, and my father had made his ultimate threat. He believed that cutting off my housing would break me. He believed that stripping away the roof over my head would force me to crawl back to his sprawling estate, begging for his forgiveness and withdrawing the assault charges against his precious golden boy. He was about to learn a very painful lesson about underestimating the daughter he threw away. I steered my wheelchair out of the van and navigated the smooth, ramped entrance of my luxury building. The concierge nodded politely as I rolled past, scanning my keycard to access the private elevator. The doors opened directly onto my floor, a feature I had specifically requested when securing the unit. As I approached my front door, a bright neon orange paper caught my eye. It was taped directly over the peephole, secured with heavy packing tape. I pulled it down, the harsh, tearing sound echoing in the silent hallway. It was an immediate notice to vacate. The document was stamped with the official seal of Oakhaven Real Estate Holdings, the property management arm of my father's corporate empire. The legal jargon was aggressive and unyielding, demanding that I surrender the premises by 6 o'clock the following morning. The notice cited a fabricated breach of contract and a termination of financial sponsorship. Harrison had not wasted a single second. The moment he stormed out of the precinct, he had mobilized his legal team to initiate an illegal retaliatory eviction, completely bypassing standard tenant rights. He wanted me out on the street before the sun came up, hoping the shock and physical hardship would force my surrender. I did not panic. I did not cry. I calmly unlocked my front door and rolled inside, locking the heavy deadbolt behind me. As I moved into the spacious living room, my phone began to vibrate violently against the armrest of my wheelchair. The screen lit up with a continuous stream of notifications from the Caldwell family group chat. I had muted the chat years ago, but the sheer volume of messages was triggering the emergency bypass alerts. I picked up the device and opened the thread. Cameron was already out on bail. Harrison's deep pockets had ensured his stay in a holding cell was remarkably brief. Cameron's text messages were a chaotic mess of typos and pure, unadulterated rage. He called me every vile name he could think of, blaming me for his ruined engagement party and his brief stint behind bars. "Enjoy the streets," cripple one of his messages read. "Dad is kicking you out right now. Let us see how tough you are when you are sleeping in a shelter. You are nothing without our money." A moment later, my mother Linda chimed into the group chat. Her messages were dressed up in a toxic, manipulative version of tough love, a specialty she had perfected over decades of emotional abuse. "Tessa, you brought this entirely on yourself," Linda wrote. "We have given you everything since your unfortunate accident. We paid for your apartment. We paid for your treatments. We put up with your constant need for attention. Sending the police to arrest your own brother was the final straw. Your father is simply exercising his rights. You will finally learn your place in the world. When you are ready to apologize and drop these ridiculous charges, we can discuss finding you a modest assisted living facility. Until then, you are on your own." I sat in the quiet glow of my living room reading their words over and over. They genuinely believed they held all the power. They believed my entire existence was subsidized by their reluctant charity. For 5 years, I had allowed them to believe this absolute fiction. I had cashed the modest monthly allowance Harrison deposited into my account. I had signed the lease documents he provided for this condo, allowing Oakhaven Real Estate Holdings to act as the primary guarantor. I played the role of the helpless, dependent, disabled daughter to absolute perfection. It was the ultimate camouflage. I tossed the neon orange eviction notice onto the kitchen counter and rolled past the empty cardboard boxes my father assumed I would be frantically packing right now. I did not pack a single item. I did not call a moving company. I poured myself a glass of cold water and continued rolling down the wide, custom-built hallway toward the master bedroom. I bypassed the sleeping area entirely and entered the space I called the nerve center. This room looked nothing like the rest of the tastefully decorated condo. The walls were lined with high-speed server racks humming with a low, steady energy. A massive curved desk dominated the center of the room, supporting 6 high-resolution monitors. This was the fortress where I had spent the last 5 years of my life. When a drunk driver shattered my spine 5 years ago, leaving me permanently paralyzed from the waist down, my family assumed my life was effectively over. They assumed I would fade into the background, a tragic cautionary tale they could use to garner sympathy at their high society charity galas. But while I was lying in a hospital bed staring at the ceiling and coming to terms with my new physical reality, my mind remained sharper than ever. I realized very quickly that physical strength was not the only kind of power in this world. Information was power, data was power, money was the ultimate power. I had always possessed a brilliant mathematical mind. Before the crash, I was preparing to enter a top-tier accounting program. After the crash, I funneled all my pain, all my rage, and all my relentless focus into the digital world. I became a certified forensic accountant, specializing in international asset tracing. I built a firm that existed entirely in the cloud, utilizing encrypted networks and highly secured communication channels. I did not work for local businesses. I worked for massive international banking consortiums, sovereign wealth funds, and elite private investigation firms. When a corrupt billionaire tried to hide his assets in a web of offshore shell companies during a messy divorce, they called me. When a corporate cartel attempted to launder money through fake logistics companies, I was the one who followed the digital breadcrumbs and exposed their entire operation. I was a predator in the financial ecosystem, a ghost in the machine who could dismantle a corporate empire with a few lines of code and a perfectly timed audit. My services commanded astronomical fees. Over the past 5 years, I had quietly amassed a net worth that completely dwarfed my father's regional logistics company. I was a multimillionaire many times over. My wealth was diversified, heavily shielded, and completely untraceable to Tessa Caldwell, the poor paralyzed girl my family loved to pity. I let them pay for the lease on this condo because it kept them complacent. It kept their eyes off me. If they thought they controlled my housing, they never bothered to look deeper into my life. It gave me the perfect vantage point to observe their business dealings. Because while I was tracking down stolen funds for international clients, I was also running a continuous, highly illegal background audit on Oakhaven Logistics. I knew exactly how heavily leveraged my father was. I knew about the cooked books, the phantom inventory, and the massive commercial loans he was barely managing to service. I set my glass of water down on the desk and woke up my computer monitors. The screens flared to life, casting a stark blue light across my face. I brought up the financial dossier I had been building on my father for half a decade. Harrison thought he was a king, but his empire was built on a fragile house of cards, sustained entirely by massive lines of credit from a single regional lender called Vanguard Trust. I opened my highly secured encrypted email client. I did not draft a plea for help. I did not write to a lawyer asking how to fight a bogus eviction notice. I drafted a message to Elias Vance, my primary wealth manager and proxy representative stationed in Zurich. Elias managed my aggressive acquisition portfolio, acting entirely on my behalf through a series of anonymous corporate entities. The subject line of the email was simple and direct: Operation Oakhaven, execution phase. I let my fingers fly across the mechanical keyboard, outlining a surgical financial strike designed to annihilate my father's entire foundation. I instructed Elias to immediately liquidate a specific block of my offshore technology assets, freeing up a massive wave of liquid capital. I directed him to use that capital to initiate a hostile, aggressive buyout of the commercial debt portfolios held by Vanguard Trust. Vanguard was a mid-sized bank, and they had been struggling with liquidity issues for the past 2 quarters. I knew from my deep network analysis that they were desperate for a cash injection. If my anonymous holding company offered to buy up their highest-risk commercial loans at a premium, they would sell without asking a single question. Harrison's primary commercial mortgages, the massive loans keeping his logistics company afloat, and his real estate holdings out of bankruptcy were bundled right in the center of that high-risk portfolio. I typed out the final parameters of the order. I wanted absolute control of Oakhaven's debt by the time the financial markets opened in the morning. I wanted every promissory note, every mortgage deed, and every line of credit transferred into a holding company where I was the sole majority shareholder. Harrison wanted to throw me out of my apartment by sunrise. He wanted to use his perceived financial dominance to crush my spirit and force me into submission. He had no idea that while he was drafting a fake eviction notice, I was buying the very ground he walked on. I read over the email one last time, ensuring every financial directive was perfectly clear and legally binding. I did not feel an ounce of hesitation. I did not feel a shred of daughterly guilt. They had made their choice in that police station. They had chosen the golden child who broke my spine over the daughter who survived it. They had declared war. I pressed the send button. The encrypted message vanished into the digital ether, speeding toward Switzerland. The dominoes were officially in motion, falling exactly where I had placed them. I pushed myself away from the desk, rolled back into the living room, and poured myself a glass of very expensive, very hidden vintage wine. I looked at the bright orange eviction notice resting on my kitchen counter, smiled, and waited for the sun to come up. The morning sun breached the downtown skyline when the heavy glass doors of my luxury condominium building were violently shoved open. Harrison and Linda marched into the pristine lobby like conquering generals flanked by three hulking men in cheap dark suits. The polished marble floors echoed with the aggressive thud of my father's expensive leather shoes. I watched the entire spectacle unfold on my custom security monitors from the comfort of my penthouse. Harrison marched directly up to the polished mahogany concierge desk. Mr. Sterling, the senior building manager, looked up from his morning reports. His expression remained perfectly neutral. "Good morning, Mr. Caldwell." Mr. Sterling said, his voice a model of professional restraint and calm authority. Harrison slammed a heavy fist down on the mahogany desk. "There will be no pleasantries this morning, Sterling," my father barked. His face was flushed with the leftover rage from the police precinct. "I am here to execute an immediate eviction order for Penthouse Suite 4. I want Tessa's keycard deactivated right this second. Send your maintenance crew upstairs immediately. These men will be assisting in the physical removal of her belongings to the curb." Linda stood close beside him. She adjusted her designer silk scarf with a look of supreme entitlement. "We simply cannot tolerate delinquent tenants who refuse to respect the rules of this establishment," my mother added. She pitched her voice loud enough for the few early morning commuters in the lobby to hear clearly. "She is completely unhinged and poses a massive liability to your respectable residents. We are actually doing this building a tremendous favor by removing her today." Mr. Sterling did not flinch. He did not reach for his computer terminal to deactivate my access. He simply looked at my parents with a calm, unwavering gaze. "I am afraid I cannot accommodate that request, Mr. Caldwell," the building manager replied smoothly. Harrison stared at him as if the man had suddenly started speaking a foreign language. "What do you mean you cannot accommodate the request?" my father demanded. His aggressive voice echoed harshly off the high architectural ceilings. "I am the managing director of Oak Haven Real Estate Holdings. We represent the guarantor of that specific lease. I posted the notice to vacate last night. You work for the management company that answers to the building owners." Mr. Sterling reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a crisp white envelope. He slid it slowly across the mahogany desk toward my father. "Actually, sir, I work directly for the building owners," Mr. Sterling corrected gently. "And as of this morning, I have been instructed to hand you this certified letter regarding your unauthorized presence on the premises." Harrison snatched the envelope from the desk. He tore it open with sharp, angry movements. His eyes scanned the heavy legal parchment inside. I watched on my monitor as his brow furrowed in deep confusion. The document was a formal cease and desist order. It explicitly barred Harrison Caldwell, Linda Caldwell, and any representatives of Oak Haven Real Estate Holdings from entering the building or harassing any of its tenants under threat of immediate arrest. Before Harrison could formulate a coherent response, the soft electronic chime of the private penthouse elevator echoed through the lobby. The polished silver doors slid open seamlessly. I rolled out into the expansive lobby space. I was wearing a tailored charcoal blazer and sipping a freshly brewed espresso from a ceramic mug. The three hired security goons immediately turned toward me, their hands flexing, waiting for an order from my father to forcibly remove me from the building. "Good morning, everyone," I said clearly. My voice easily cut through the tense, heavy silence of the room. "I see you received my letter, Harrison." My father crumpled the certified letter in his massive fist. He stepped aggressively toward my wheelchair. "What is this garbage, Tessa?" he shouted. "You think a fake cease and desist order is going to save you from eviction? I own the company that guarantees your lease. You are a dependent tenant. I can throw you out onto the street whenever I please, and I please to do it right now." He snapped his fingers sharply at the three security contractors. "Grab her chair and push her out the front doors." The men took a hesitant step forward. Mr. Sterling immediately raised a hand. "I strongly advise against touching that wheelchair, gentlemen," the building manager warned. His tone was suddenly laced with absolute unyielding authority. "If you lay a single finger on Miss Caldwell, I will have the police here in 2 minutes to arrest you all for trespassing and criminal assault." Harrison let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "Trespassing," he mocked cruelly. "I am practically the owner of her unit." "That is where you are fundamentally mistaken," I said, meeting my father's furious dark gaze. "Oak Haven Real Estate Holdings guarantees a lease for a tenant. That is correct. But you do not own the unit, and you certainly do not own this entire building." My mother crossed her arms tightly over her chest. "Stop speaking in ridiculous riddles, Tessa. We know exactly who owns this building. It is held by a corporate conglomerate out of Delaware. We checked the property records 5 years ago when we placed you here." "You checked the public records 5 years ago," I corrected her smoothly. "A lot of things can change in 5 years, Linda. For example, 6 months ago, that Delaware conglomerate sold this entire residential tower to a private equity shell corporation called Apex Holdings." Harrison glared at me with pure venom. "What does that have to do with anything?" he demanded roughly. "Why do you care who owns the building? You are still being evicted today." I smiled. It was a small, cold smile that completely unsettled his arrogant posture. "Because, Harrison, I am Apex Holdings," I stated clearly. "I am the sole majority shareholder and the absolute owner of this entire corporate structure. I bought this building 6 months ago with cash. Every single brick, every pane of glass, and every lease agreement belongs exclusively to me. I am the landlord. I am—" The silence that followed my declaration was absolute and heavy. The three hired security guards looked at each other in total confusion, realizing they had just been ordered to assault the actual multi-million-dollar owner of the luxury high-rise. Mr. Sterling offered a small, respectful nod in my direction, firmly validating my legal claim in front of everyone present. Harrison's face cycled rapidly through disbelief, extreme confusion, and finally, pure, unadulterated rage. He turned a deep, mottled shade of purple. "You are lying," he sputtered defensively. His voice was completely devoid of its usual arrogant, overpowering boom. "There is absolutely no way you could afford to purchase a $50 million residential tower. You have not worked a real job in 5 long years. You sit in this apartment living off my charity. You are a paralyzed dependent." I set my espresso mug down gently on a small marble side table. I looked directly at the man who had spent my entire life attempting to minimize my existence. "I am a highly specialized forensic accountant, Harrison. I investigate international corporate fraud for financial entities much larger and much smarter than you will ever be. Over the last 5 years, I have built a lucrative empire tracing hidden assets for global banks, quietly amassing a fortune that dwarfs yours. I am a multimillionaire. The money you graciously deposited into my checking account every month was barely enough to cover my morning coffee budget. I let you pay for this lease because it kept your massive, fragile ego satisfied. It kept you completely blind to what I was actually doing behind closed doors." Linda stepped forward, her perfectly manicured hands shaking slightly by her sides. "This is impossible," she whispered, her eyes darting frantically around the opulent luxury lobby, as if seeing it for the very first time. "You are trying to trick us with fake documents." "Mr. Sterling," I said without breaking eye contact with my mother, "could you please clarify the current status of the eviction notice posted on my door last night?" "Certainly, Miss Caldwell," the building manager replied crisply. "The notice to vacate posted by Oak Haven Real Estate Holdings is legally void. A guarantor cannot evict the legal property owner. Furthermore, Oak Haven Real Estate Holdings is now officially banned from the premises due to aggressive and harassing behavior toward the ownership." The profound power shift in the room was palpable and absolute. Harrison was breathing heavily through his nose. His entire controlling worldview was crumbling into dust right in front of his hired thugs and the building staff. Instead of stripping away my dignity and casting me out onto the street, he was standing in the center of my property, entirely powerless, exposed as a pathetic fool who knew absolutely nothing about his own daughter. He was a regional logistics manager playing checkers, and I was moving pieces on a global financial chessboard. Harrison opened his mouth to scream something else, but no sound came out. The sheer magnitude of the shock had temporarily paralyzed his vocal cords. He looked down at my wheelchair, then up at the high, decorative ceiling, trying desperately to reconcile the disabled daughter he despised with the corporate landlord who now controlled his complete humiliation. Linda, however, refused to accept total defeat gracefully. She possessed a cruel, calculating instinct for sheer survival. When cornered, she always searched for the most vulnerable emotional point to strike. Her face hardened into a mask of pure malice. She stepped abruptly in front of my father, inserting herself between us to save his fragile ego from any further embarrassment. She looked down at me with a sneer that twisted her elegant features into something incredibly ugly. "Enjoy your little apartment. Let's see how long you keep it when I freeze the medical trust fund paying for your physical therapy." I stared back at my mother without blinking. The medical trust fund was established by my late grandfather specifically to cover my physical rehabilitation, my custom mobility equipment, and my daily care after the catastrophic crash. It was supposed to be a legally untouchable, ironclad safety net. My grandfather knew exactly what kind of ruthless, manipulative people my parents were, which was why he appointed a third-party legal firm to manage the financial disbursements. But Harrison and Linda had spent the last 5 years slowly and methodically poisoning that well. They had used their high-priced corporate lawyers to quietly submit fabricated psychological evaluations to the trustees, suggesting I was mentally unfit to manage my own complex medical affairs. They had slowly gained backdoor administrative influence over the accounts through sheer persistence and fraudulent paperwork. I knew that if I showed even a single ounce of fear, they would only tighten the noose. My grandfather built his fortune with integrity, a trait my parents completely lacked. They viewed wealth only as a weapon to control others. They were finally aiming that weapon directly at my life support system, fully expecting me to shatter under the immense calculated financial pressure. By noon that same day, my private cell phone rang. It was the billing department at my specialized physical therapy clinic. The senior receptionist sounded deeply apologetic and incredibly nervous. She informed me that my primary payment account had been abruptly frozen by the trustees due to an emergency legal petition regarding my mental competency. My parents were actually trying to cut off my vital medical care. They wanted my muscles to atrophy. They wanted me to suffer physically and financially, so I would be forced to crawl back to their sprawling estate and beg for access to my own money. They desperately wanted me to drop the felony assault charges against their violent golden boy in exchange for my basic human health care. I thanked the receptionist, calmly opened my highly secure banking application, and wired the clinic enough liquid cash to cover my intensive therapy sessions for the next 10 straight years. The financial freeze meant absolutely nothing to my actual bottom line, but the sheer, breathtaking cruelty of their tactic completely solidified my resolve. They were willing to sacrifice my basic human health to protect Cameron and his fragile reputation. It was a level of toxic depravity that demanded absolute, uncompromising destruction. While my parents waged their silent financial war, my soon-to-be former sister-in-law decided to launch a massive public offensive. Sophie was a mid-level social media influencer who thrived on manufactured drama, aesthetic perfection, and harvesting digital sympathy from gullible strangers. By late afternoon, a link began circulating rapidly through the local high society networks and bleeding out into the wider public sphere. It was a highly produced, heavily edited GoFundMe campaign video. I sat in my quiet home office and watched the dramatic video on my glowing monitors. Sophie was sitting on a plush, beige sofa, wearing a simple, oversized sweater and deliberately minimal makeup to look sufficiently distressed and authentic. She cried perfect, glistening tears directly into the high-definition camera lens. She told her hundreds of thousands of devoted followers a heartbreaking, completely fabricated story. She claimed that her brilliant, successful fiancé Cameron was the tragic victim of a vicious, coordinated extortion attempt by his mentally unstable, manipulative grifter of a sister. She told the entire world that I had faked the severity of my spinal injuries for years, manipulating my wealthy, loving family out of millions of dollars to fund a lavish, secret lifestyle. She claimed that I had deliberately provoked Cameron at their beautiful engagement party, and that I was now trying to ruin their upcoming fairy tale wedding because I was intensely jealous of their perfect love story. The video was a terrifying masterclass in weaponized tears and digital manipulation. It went completely viral within hours, shared across multiple platforms by outraged viewers. Sophie begged her followers for immediate monetary donations to help cover Cameron's mounting legal defense fees against my malicious, unfounded assault charges. But the campaign was not just about raising money to cover bail and lawyers. It was a targeted, aggressive smear campaign designed to completely obliterate my personal and professional reputation. My private accounting firm operated mostly in the shadows, catering to exclusive international clients, but I did maintain a clean public-facing consultancy website to field incoming corporate inquiries. Sophie's rabid followers quickly found it. Within 24 hours, my business page was flooded with hundreds of fake negative reviews. They called me a scam artist, a criminal, and a psychotic liar who preyed on her own family. The contact form on my website became a dark repository for graphic, terrifying death threats. Anonymous users told me I deserved to be paralyzed and promised to finish the violent job Cameron had started at the country club. My phone buzzed continuously with automated hate messages, vicious voicemails, and cruel text messages from blocked numbers. My parents and Sophie clearly believed this digital avalanche would break my spirit and force a public surrender. They expected me to panic. They expected me to post a tearful defensive rebuttal video to plead my case in the messy court of public opinion and to engage in a pathetic online war of words that would only make me look exactly as crazy as they claimed I was. They fundamentally misunderstood who they were dealing with. I did not shed a single tear over their petty digital harassment. I did not log into my social media accounts to argue with unhinged strangers on the internet. Defending myself publicly would only give oxygen to their fabricated fire. Instead of fighting a loud, useless battle in the comment sections, I rolled my wheelchair directly into my secure nerve center. I locked the heavy oak door, powered up my primary server arrays, and prepared to do exactly what I did best. I was a top-tier forensic accountant. I spent my days hunting down the most elusive, sophisticated financial criminals on the planet by tracing their digital footprints through impossible labyrinths of encrypted data and offshore accounts. A bunch of angry internet trolls deployed by a crying influencer were essentially child's play for someone with my specific skill set. I pulled up the back-end analytics for my public-facing website. I isolated the incoming traffic data from the massive flood of fake reviews and malicious contact form submissions. I deployed a highly specialized data mining algorithm I had written specifically for tracking coordinated corporate sabotage and digital espionage. The advanced algorithm began scraping the raw data, pulling IP addresses, routing pathways, and device identifiers from every single hateful message and fraudulent review. I watched the bright green lines of code cascade across my 6 high-resolution monitors, sorting the absolute chaos into clean, readable intelligence. Real organic internet outrage is messy and geographically scattered. When a video goes viral naturally, the angry responses come from all over the country, generated by random individuals, using thousands of different cellular networks and residential internet service providers. But as my software compiled and analyzed the data, a very different, highly suspicious pattern began to emerge. The death threats, the fake reviews, and the aggressive comments amplifying Sophie's GoFundMe campaign were not organic at all. They were incredibly synchronized. They were being posted in distinct, clustered waves, utilizing a rotating series of expensive proxy servers designed to mask their true origins. It was a textbook bot farm operation. This was a coordinated, expensive digital attack purchased and deployed by someone with significant financial resources. Someone was paying a massive premium to a shady reputation management firm To artificially inflate Sophie's victim narrative, bury my business in fake complaints, and permanently destroy my digital life. I leaned forward in my wheelchair, my fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard as I initiated a deep, aggressive trace on the proxy servers. I bypassed their basic security protocols, peeling back the thick layers of digital camouflage one by one. I followed the digital money trail, tracking the server requests back to their absolute primary source. The trace results began to populate on my center monitor, mapping the specific origin points of the most aggressive anonymous troll accounts. The glowing red dots on the digital map did not scatter across the city or the state. They converged rapidly, pulling together into a single, undeniable geographic location. The complex trace results locked onto one very specific commercial building in the downtown financial district. Every single coordinated attack against me, every graphic death threat, every fake negative review, and every automated bot amplifying Sophie's tearful video was originating directly from Harrison's corporate headquarters. My father was using his own company network to fund a massive cyber war against his paralyzed daughter, handling the operation, so carelessly handing me the exact digital evidence I ultimately needed to completely destroy his entire corporate legacy. I traced the two IP addresses directly back to the physical servers sitting inside the climate-controlled basement of Oakhaven Logistics. My father thought he was safe behind enterprise-grade firewalls and expensive cybersecurity consultants. He had forgotten one crucial detail. 7 years ago, long before the accident, I was a diligent accounting student, eager to please my demanding father. During a summer internship, I had helped upgrade the company network architecture. I had quietly embedded a persistent administrative backdoor deep within the legacy code. It was a redundant access point meant for emergency remote troubleshooting. I had never used it. I had completely forgotten it existed until this exact moment. I routed my connection through a series of offshore virtual private networks and gently knocked on the Oakhaven firewall. The old backdoor recognized my original digital signature and silently swung open, granting me unrestricted master access to my father's entire corporate domain. I bypassed the active security monitors and slid into the financial databases, searching for the billing invoices tied to Sophie's smear campaign. I found the receipts in minutes. Harrison had wired $50,000 to a notorious digital black ops firm operating out of Eastern Europe. The transaction was logged under a fake marketing expense. I downloaded the entire transaction history, capturing the exact routing numbers and authorization signatures. But as I prepared to sever the connection and retreat into the shadows, a localized subserver caught my eye. It was an archived partition, disconnected from the primary company network, and buried beneath layers of obsolete security protocols. The folder was labeled simply, May 14th. My heart slammed against my ribs, a sudden cold dread washing over my skin. May 14th was not a fiscal quarter deadline. It was not a tax filing date. May 14th was the exact date of my car crash 5 years ago. The folder was locked behind military-grade encryption. Harrison had spared no expense to bury whatever was inside. But encryption is just math, and math is a language I speak fluently. I launched a brute-force decryption algorithm, harnessing the combined processing power of my 6 high-speed servers. The cooling fans in my nerve center roared to life, spinning at maximum capacity as my software battered against the digital locks. I sat in my wheelchair, my hands gripping the armrest so tightly my knuckles turned white. It took exactly 42 minutes for the encryption to shatter. The folder opened, spilling its contents across my main monitor. It was a digitized ledger, a comprehensive record of a massive illegal cover-up. The first document was a scanned image of a cashier's check for $100,000 made out to an independent auto salvage yard located 3 counties away. The memo line read simply "scrap and crush." Next to it was a detailed wire transfer confirmation for $250,000. The recipient was a holding company, registered to the former county sheriff, a man who had abruptly resigned in disgrace just 6 months after my accident, amid rumors of corruption. My eyes darted across the screen, pulling up file after file. There were police dispatch logs that had been manually altered. There were internal bank memos authorizing the movement of untraceable cash. And then I found the photographs. They were high-resolution digital images taken on the night of the crash, captured before the official police response units arrived on the scene. I clicked on the first image, and the breath left my lungs in a violent rush. It was my car wrapped around a heavy oak tree in a deserted ditch. But the driver's side airbag was deployed, and it was covered in blood. My blood type is O negative. The medical records clearly showed I did not bleed from my face or chest during the crash. The blood on that steering wheel did not belong to me. I clicked to the next photograph. It showed the interior of the vehicle illuminated by a harsh camera flash. The driver's seat was pushed far back, adjusted perfectly for a man who was over 6 feet tall. I am 5 feet 4 inches. I could not have physically reached the pedals from that seating position. The horrific truth slammed into my mind, reconstructing the shattered memories of that night with perfect, terrifying clarity. I was not driving. I had gone to a party to pick up my brother because he was blackout drunk and refused to call a cab. We had argued in the driveway. He had snatched the keys from my hand, shoved me into the passenger seat, and sped off into the dark. Cameron crashed the car. Cameron broke my spine. I stared at the monitors, my entire body shaking with a rage so profound it felt like a physical burning in my blood. When the car hit the tree, my spine was severed instantly. I was unconscious, bleeding internally, trapped in the crushed metal of the passenger side. Cameron had survived the impact. He had dragged himself out of the driver's seat, bleeding from a facial laceration. But instead of calling an ambulance, instead of trying to save his dying sister, he had called our father. Harrison arrived before the police. He assessed the situation, saw his golden boy bleeding, and saw his daughter paralyzed and unconscious. He made a calculated corporate decision right there in the dirt. He instructed Cameron to drag my broken, paralyzed body across the center console and dump me into the driver's seat. He paid the corrupt sheriff to alter the crash scene reports. He paid the mechanic to crush the vehicle before an independent insurance investigator could examine the airbag blood spatter and the seat positions. Harrison Caldwell spent hundreds of thousands of dollars to frame his own daughter for a catastrophic accident just to protect his son from a felony vehicular assault charge. They let me wake up in a hospital bed completely alone. They let the doctors tell me I was permanently paralyzed. They stood by my bedside and watched me cry, watched me blame myself for the accident, watched me drown in guilt and self-hatred for 5 long years. They fed me a fabricated story about losing control of the wheel, knowing all along that Cameron was the one who destroyed my legs. Harrison used my tragic accident to secure sympathy contracts for his logistics business. Linda used my disability to play the role of the long-suffering devoted mother at her high society luncheons. Cameron lived a life of total freedom, untethered by guilt or consequence, while I was confined to a wheelchair. They had stolen my mobility, and then they had systematically stolen my truth. I spent thousands of hours in agonizing physical therapy sessions, fighting for fractions of an inch of movement while my own family smiled and accepted praise for their unwavering charity. Every comforting touch was a calculated lie. Every word of encouragement was a carefully rehearsed, sickening performance. The urge to pick up the phone and call the state police was overwhelming. I had enough hard digital evidence to send my father, my brother, and the former sheriff to federal prison for a very long time. I could hand this encrypted folder to Detective Miller and watch my family's entire empire burn to ashes before dinner time. But sending them to prison instantly was too fast. It was too easy. They had subjected me to half a decade of psychological torture. They deserved to feel the exact same terror, the exact same helpless dread that I had felt waking up in that cold hospital room. I closed out of the police dispatch logs and the wire transfer records. I isolated the single highest resolution photograph of the driver's side steering wheel. The image clearly showed the deployed airbag, the shattered dashboard, and the distinct, undeniable smears of Cameron's blood. I routed the image to my heavy-duty laser printer. The machine hummed and whirred, spitting out a crisp, glossy 8 by 10 color photograph. The vivid red blood stood out in stark contrast against the white fabric of the airbag. I picked up the photograph and let the ink dry. I did not write a letter. I did not include a list of demands. I grabbed a plain, unmarked manila envelope from my desk drawer. I slid the photograph inside and sealed the flap securely. I printed a mailing label addressed directly to Cameron Caldwell at his private luxury townhouse. I bypassed his secure corporate mailroom and sent it straight to his personal residence. Let him open the Daily Mail. Let him slide his bare hand inside the smooth envelope. Let him stare at the indisputable physical evidence of his ultimate, unforgivable sin. The digital smear campaign against my business meant absolutely nothing now. My parents thought they were engaging in clever financial warfare. They had no idea they had just freely handed me the nuclear launch codes. The unmarked manila envelope rested precisely in the exact center of Cameron's glass desk at Oakhaven Logistics headquarters. I used a specialized private courier service to ensure the package bypassed standard corporate mail screening entirely. It was marked strictly confidential, requiring a direct signature from the Vice President of Operations. Cameron arrived at his corner executive office nursing a severe hangover from the previous night's chaotic events and his humiliating stint in the downtown police precinct holding cell. He threw his tailored suit jacket carelessly over his leather chair and reached for the envelope. He tore open the sealed flap without a second of hesitation, assuming it was a batch of routine legal documents regarding his upcoming wedding or an update from his highly paid defense attorneys. He slid the photograph out and stared at it. The vibrant colors of the image shattered his insulated world. All color instantly drained from his usually tanned face. He was looking at the interior of my crushed, mangled vehicle illuminated by the harsh flash of an unreleased crime scene camera. He stared at the deployed driver's side airbag. It was heavily stained with thick crimson smears. He knew exactly whose blood was on that white fabric. He knew it was his own O-negative blood drawn from the deep facial laceration he sustained when he plowed my car into that massive oak tree. He stared at the driver's seat, noting how it was pushed all the way back to accommodate his 6'2" frame, an undeniable physical impossibility for a driver of my short height. The horrific truth he and my father had buried under a mountain of illicit cash 5 years ago was sitting right in front of him, fully exposed to the daylight. The air in his office felt impossibly thin. Cameron dropped the photograph onto the desk as if it were burning his skin. A violent wave of pure psychological terror crashed over him. His hands began to shake. He stumbled backward, his expensive leather shoes scraping against the hardwood floor, and quickly locked his office door. He blindly reached for the automated switch to draw the heavy window blinds, plunging the executive suite into deep shadows. Paranoia immediately consumed his fragile mind. Who had sent this photograph? Who possessed this highly classified, deeply buried evidence? His mind raced through a list of potential blackmailers. Was it the disgraced former sheriff demanding another payout? Was it the salvage yard mechanic who was supposed to crush the vehicle into an unrecognizable cube of scrap metal? He never once suspected me. In his arrogant, narrow mind, I was just the helpless, paralyzed sister they had successfully framed and destroyed. Cameron staggered over to his private bar cart. He grabbed a crystal decanter of vintage scotch and bypassed the matching glasses entirely, drinking the amber liquid straight from the heavy crystal neck in frantic, desperate swallows. He needed to numb the suffocating panic. The timing of this psychological unraveling could not have been more catastrophic for the family empire. At 2 o'clock that exact afternoon, Oakhaven Logistics was scheduled to host the most critical presentation in the history of the company. Harrison Caldwell had spent the last 8 grueling months negotiating a massive exclusive distribution merger with an elite international tech conglomerate. To the outside world, Oakhaven Logistics appeared to be a highly profitable, dominant regional powerhouse. In reality, thanks to my extensive background audits, I knew the company was secretly bleeding capital from every corporate pore. They were drowning in massive, unserviceable commercial debt and were teetering on the jagged edge of total insolvency. This lucrative tech merger was the absolute lifeline Harrison had left to keep his sinking ship afloat. As vice president of operations, Cameron was the designated point man. He was scheduled to deliver the keynote logistical presentation to a boardroom full of skeptical, demanding international executives. When 2 o'clock arrived, Cameron walked into the glass-walled executive boardroom, radiating pure terror. The heavy scent of expensive scotch and stale panic preceded him into the room. He was sweating profusely, his normally immaculate hair damp and disheveled. The international executives sat around the polished conference table, their expressions instantly hardening as they took in his erratic, unprofessional demeanor. Harrison shot his son a sharp, warning glare from the head of the table, silently commanding him to pull himself together. Cameron fumbled blindly with the presentation remote, his hands trembling so violently he dropped the plastic device twice. When he finally managed to bring the first slide up on the massive projection screen, his mind went completely blank. The financial figures and logistical routing charts blurred together. Every time he looked at the glowing screen, all he could see was the vivid, bloody airbag from the photograph. He stuttered uncontrollably, losing his place in the rehearsed script, looping back over the same meaningless corporate buzzwords while the tension in the room thickened into concrete. The presentation rapidly devolved into a humiliating, agonizing train wreck. Cameron began slurring his words frantically, wiping the sweat from his forehead as he tried to explain a supply chain algorithm he clearly did not understand. He contradicted his own data points, offered wildly inaccurate delivery projections, and eventually just stopped speaking, staring blankly at the wall with wide, terrified eyes. The lead executive from the tech conglomerate did not tolerate incompetence. He slowly closed his leather-bound portfolio, stood up from the conference table, and buttoned his suit jacket. He did not say a single word. He simply offered Harrison a look of profound, withering disgust and walked out of the boardroom. His entire corporate team followed in swift, silent formation. The multi-million-dollar lifeline that was supposed to save Oakhaven Logistics evaporated into thin air in less than 20 minutes. The heavy glass doors swung shut behind the departing executives, leaving a suffocating, lethal silence in their wake. Harrison violently grabbed Cameron by the arm and dragged him back into the presidential suite. The ensuing explosion of rage was volcanic. Harrison hurled a heavy crystal paperweight against the far wall, shattering it into 1,000 glittering pieces. He screamed at Cameron until his face turned a dangerous mottled purple, berating him for his pathetic weakness and his unimaginable stupidity. But true to the toxic, deeply ingrained Caldwell family dynamic, Harrison absolutely refused to hold his golden boy accountable for the failure. As the initial blinding rage began to subside, the inevitable psychological pivot occurred. Harrison needed a scapegoat, and he would never allow that scapegoat to be his own son. He began pacing the length of the office, actively rewriting the narrative to soothe his own massive ego. He decided out loud that the tech conglomerate executives were simply arrogant fools who did not understand the regional market. He blamed the presentation software for malfunctioning. Finally, he blamed me. He claimed that the sheer emotional stress of dealing with my vicious legal actions and the resulting public scandal had simply been too much for poor Cameron to bear. Harrison placed a reassuring hand on Cameron's shoulder, promising his drunken, trembling son that they would weather this storm together. But corporate delusion does not pay commercial creditors, and Harrison knew it. Without the massive capital injection from the tech merger, Oakhaven Logistics was completely out of time. They were scheduled to miss payroll by the end of the week. Key regional suppliers were already threatening to halt operations due to outstanding severely delinquent invoices. The ruthless commercial lenders were circling like starving vultures. Harrison needed a massive wave of immediate, untraceable liquid capital just to keep the corporate lights turned on. He dismissed Cameron and retreated to his private administrative terminal, locking the heavy mahogany door behind him. Desperation drives greedy men to commit incredibly stupid, reckless acts. Harrison booted up his secure computer and navigated directly to the administrative portals for my grandfather's medical trust fund. Harrison and Linda had already frozen my ability to pay for my physical therapy by leveraging their fraudulent psychological evaluations. But simply freezing the account was no longer enough. Harrison needed that cash. He assumed that because he possessed the backdoor administrative credentials, the millions of dollars sitting untouched in that medical trust were ripe for the taking. He decided to cross the ultimate legal line. He initiated an illegal emergency liquidation of the entire trust principal, intending to quietly funnel my dedicated medical lifeline directly into Oakhaven's depleted corporate accounts. He justified the theft in his own mind as a temporary loan, a necessary sacrifice to save the family legacy. He typed in his master override authorization codes, his fingers flying across the keyboard with greedy, desperate anticipation. He confidently clicked the final submit execution button to initiate the massive wire transfer. The screen instantly froze. The corporate loading icon stopped spinning. The background went completely black. A bright, glaring red box slowly materialized in the dead center of his high-definition monitor. Access completely denied. Harrison stared at the glowing red box on his monitor, his mind completely refusing to process the reality of the denial. He was the undisputed master of Oakhaven logistics, a man who moved millions with a single keystroke. He slammed his fist onto the keyboard, violently refreshing the browser, but the uncompromising red text remained etched across the screen. The medical trust fund was supposed to be his ultimate safety net, a reservoir of untouchable cash he had spent years slowly compromising through quiet legal maneuvers and carefully crafted backroom deals. He needed that liquidity by Friday, or his entire corporate empire would shatter under the weight of its own leveraged debt. He carried a leather briefcase containing a meticulously forged, highly authentic-looking power of attorney document. He had paid a corrupt notary thousands of dollars to backdate the seal, granting him absolute, uncontested administrative control over Tessa's medical trust. He was confident that a physical piece of paper presented with his usual overbearing corporate intimidation would steamroll whatever minor technical glitch had frozen the online portal. His driver navigated the sleek black town car through the downtown financial district, pulling up to the polished granite entrance of Sterling and Vance Private Wealth Management. Harrison bypassed the main teller lines, entirely ignoring the polite greetings of the reception staff. He marched directly toward the frosted glass doors of the executive management wing, projecting an aura of absolute, unquestionable authority. He pushed open the heavy door to the office of Arthur Sterling, the senior branch manager who had handled the Caldwell family accounts for nearly 2 decades. Harrison slammed his leather briefcase onto the desk and snapped the brass latches open. "There is a catastrophic technical failure in your online portal," Harrison barked, his voice echoing loudly in the quiet office. "I need an immediate manual wire transfer of $4 million from the Caldwell Medical Trust directly into the primary Oakhaven operational account." He simply sat there, his hands trembling slightly, as he looked at Harrison with an expression that bordered on profound pity mixed with absolute terror. Harrison pulled the forged power of attorney from the briefcase and shoved it across the polished wood. "My daughter is mentally unfit to manage her medical affairs. I am the sole signatory. Process the wire immediately, or I will move every single corporate account Oakhaven possesses to your biggest competitor by the end of the business day." "I cannot process that transfer, Harrison. I cannot process any transfer." Harrison narrowed his eyes, his legendary temper flaring dangerously. "You will process it, Arthur, or I will have your job. Do you understand the sheer volume of capital my company brings to this bank?" Arthur shook his head, his voice dropping to a harsh, strained whisper. "You do not understand. It is not a technical glitch. The medical trust is not just frozen. Everything is frozen." Harrison froze, his hand still resting on the leather briefcase. "At 8 exactly this morning," Arthur explained, his words rushing out in a panicked stream, "we received an emergency federal injunction. A total uncompromising asset freeze was placed on the Caldwell Medical Trust. But it did not stop there. Within an hour, the freeze was aggressively expanded. Every single account bearing your name, every joint account you hold with your wife, every corporate account tied to Oakhaven Logistics, every offshore holding company, and every private investment portfolio. It is all locked down. I could not withdraw a single dollar for you even if I wanted to. Harrison felt the floor drop out from beneath him. A cold, heavy dread settled in his stomach, completely replacing his previous rage. Who authorized this? He demanded, his voice suddenly hollow. Was it the IRS? Is this a tax audit? It is not the IRS, Arthur said, turning his monitor so Harrison could see the glowing legal notice. The injunction was filed by a highly specialized, ruthless external forensic accounting firm. They presented a federal judge with an overwhelming mountain of preliminary evidence, detailing massive systemic historical fraud, corporate embezzlement, and illegal asset manipulation spanning the last 5 years. The judge granted the freeze immediately. The financial firm is currently executing a hostile deep dive audit into every single transaction you have made since the date of your daughter's car accident. Harrison stopped breathing. The date of the car accident. The forensic accounting firm was not investigating tax discrepancies. They were hunting for the payoffs. They were tracing the digital breadcrumbs he had carelessly left behind when he bribed the county sheriff and the auto mechanic. They were looking for the exact same evidence that Cameron had just received in the mail. Someone was dismantling his entire life with terrifying surgical precision. You have to give me something, Harrison pleaded, his previous arrogance entirely vanishing, replaced by naked, humiliating desperation. A temporary overdraft. I have payroll on Friday. I have suppliers threatening to halt operations. I need liquidity, Arthur. I have nothing to give you, Arthur said, his voice laced with finality. You are officially classified as a severe flight risk and a target of a massive federal fraud investigation. My legal compliance department has instructed me to terminate all communication with you immediately after delivering this notice. You need to leave my office, Harrison. Right now. Harrison stumbled out of the bank, the bright afternoon sunlight hitting him like a physical blow. The bustling financial district moved around him, completely unaware that a corporate titan had just been reduced to absolute financial ruin in a matter of minutes. He practically fell into the back seat of his waiting town car, his hands shaking so violently he could barely unlock his cellular phone. He hit the speed dial for his wife. Linda answered on the second ring, her voice tight with artificial annoyance. Harrison, I am in the middle of a charity luncheon planning committee. This better be a genuine emergency. It is all gone. Harrison gasped, struggling to pull oxygen into his lungs. The money, the accounts, the company reserves, everything is locked down. We have absolutely zero liquidity. Linda went dead silent on the other end of the line. The background noise of clinking teacups and polite society chatter abruptly vanished as she likely stepped into a private hallway. What are you talking about? She hissed, her tone instantly shifting from annoyed to terrified. Did you not transfer the trust money? There is no trust money, Harrison practically shouted, panic overriding his usual instinct to control the narrative. A forensic accounting firm locked us out. They convinced a federal judge to freeze the entire Caldwell estate. They are investigating the payoffs from the accident, Linda. They know what we did. We cannot pay the mortgages. We cannot pay the credit cards. Oakhaven is going to default on all its commercial debt by the end of the week. We are completely bankrupt. He heard a sharp intake of breath, followed by the unmistakable sound of Linda dropping her phone onto a hard tile floor. The line went dead. Harrison sat in the back of the idling car, the walls of his carefully constructed reality collapsing inward. He stared blindly out the tinted window of the town car, watching the oblivious pedestrians rushing past. They had no idea they were walking next to a hollow shell of a man. He had spent his entire life valuing wealth and status above all else, sacrificing his own daughter to protect his legacy. Now that legacy was suffocating him. His phone buzzed in his hand, a sharp, aggressive vibration that made him jump. He looked down at the screen. His hands began sweating. It was not Linda calling back. It was an urgent priority, one email notification from his corporate legal department. The subject line was written in stark, uncompromising capital letters. Emergency summons for hostile takeover initiated. Harrison opened the email, his eyes struggling to focus on the dense legal text. It was a formal, legally binding notification from the international tech conglomerate, the exact same company that had walked out of Cameron's disastrous presentation just hours ago. They were not simply walking away from the distribution merger. They were actively weaponizing Oakhaven's sudden catastrophic vulnerability. The email detailed that the conglomerate had quietly purchased a massive portion of Oakhaven's outstanding highly leveraged commercial debt from panicked secondary lenders. They now held the vast majority of the company's financial obligations. Acting as the primary creditor, the tech giant was legally forcing an emergency mandatory shareholder meeting at exactly 9 in the morning tomorrow. The singular item on the corporate agenda was a brutal, uncompromising vote to enact a total hostile takeover, forcibly stripping Harrison of his position and liquidating Oakhaven Logistics for pennies on the dollar. He was trapped. There was no escape. He closed his eyes. He wept. The brilliant, invisible architect of this entire operation had perfectly orchestrated his absolute and total destruction, leaving him with absolutely nothing left to leverage. The morning sun cast long, unforgiving shadows across the glass facade of Oakhaven Logistics headquarters. Harrison Caldwell stepped out of his town car, adjusting his imported silk tie with trembling hands. Beside him, Linda smoothed the skirt of her designer dress, her face a rigid mask of suppressed panic and weaponized denial. She had spent the entire car ride aggressively applying makeup to hide the dark circles under her eyes, refusing to speak a single word about the catastrophic financial freeze. Trailing behind them, Cameron looked like a walking corpse. He was sweating through his suit, his eyes bloodshot and darting frantically at every passing shadow. The residual alcohol from his desperate night-long binge oozed from his pores. They moved through the grand lobby in complete silence, ignoring the terrified whispers of the administrative staff who had already heard the devastating rumors about missed payrolls and frozen corporate accounts. Harrison marched toward the private executive elevator, marshaling every last ounce of his legendary intimidation tactics. He was a cornered predator stripped of his wealth and his power, running purely on the fumes of his own colossal ego. He planned to walk into that boardroom and deliver the performance of his life. He would lie, manipulate, and coerce the board of directors into rejecting the hostile takeover. He would promise them phantom capital, fabricate fake investors, and leverage decades of corporate loyalty to buy himself just a few more days to untangle the federal injunction. He pushed open the heavy mahogany doors of the primary boardroom, expecting to see a room full of frightened, easily manipulated subordinates. Instead, the massive oval table was packed with the grim, uncompromising faces of Oakhaven's senior shareholders, regional directors, and the elite corporate attorneys representing the international tech conglomerate. The atmosphere in the room was suffocatingly tense, heavy with the undeniable stench of impending corporate slaughter. Harrison took his customary seat at the head of the table, flanked by Linda and Cameron. He did not sit. He stood tall, planting his knuckles firmly on the polished wood, adopting his most authoritative, commanding posture. He began his desperate plea, projecting a false, hollow confidence that echoed loudly in the cavernous room. He addressed the board members by their first names, reminding them of the profits they had shared over the past 2 decades. He smoothly dismissed the hostile takeover bid as a predatory, insulting tactic deployed by a disorganized tech firm that fundamentally misunderstood the logistics industry. He explicitly lied to their faces, claiming the current financial freeze was nothing more than a clerical error triggered by an overzealous tax auditor, promising that his private bankers were resolving the issue before the end of the business day. He begged them, his voice rising in manufactured passion, to reject the conglomerate's insulting offer of pennies on the dollar and stand united behind the Caldwell family legacy. He promised them guaranteed returns, painting a vivid, entirely fictional picture of a massive offshore capital injection he had personally secured just hours ago. He looked around the table, waiting for the nods of agreement, waiting for the familiar submission he had always commanded from these people. Nobody moved, nobody nodded. The shareholders simply stared at him with cold, impassive eyes. The lead attorney for the tech conglomerate, a sharp-featured woman in a gray suit, tapped her pen rhythmically against her legal pad, clearly unimpressed by Harrison's theatrical desperation. The silence dragged on thick and deeply uncomfortable. Cameron shifted in his seat, his breathing shallow and rapid, looking like he was seconds away from a complete nervous breakdown. Linda maintained her rigid posture, her jaw clenched so tightly her teeth threatened to crack. Harrison opened his mouth to speak again, to escalate his promises, to threaten them if necessary. Harrison slammed his fist against the table, the sudden noise cracking like a gunshot in the silent room. He pointed a trembling finger at the senior directors, men and women he had personally hired and bullied into submission over the years. He demanded their loyalty. He reminded them that Oakhaven Logistics was his creation, built on his sweat and his unyielding vision. He told them that selling the company to a faceless tech giant would destroy their local community, sever their long-standing supplier relationships, and leave them all at the mercy of algorithms and corporate downsizing. He played every emotional card he possessed, shifting rapidly from aggressive intimidation to pathetic pleading. He promised to personally guarantee their stock options, using his own private wealth, a blatantly fraudulent offer, considering every single cent he owned was currently locked down by a federal judge. The lead attorney for the tech conglomerate finally stopped tapping her pen. She looked directly at Harrison, her expression completely devoid of sympathy. She stated calmly that the tech conglomerate now legally held 78% of Oakhaven's secured commercial debt. She reminded him that the company was already in technical default, that payroll would fail tomorrow morning, and that rejecting the hostile takeover would instantly trigger a forced catastrophic bankruptcy liquidation. She explained that the board was legally obligated to vote in the best fiduciary interest of the shareholders, and right now the only viable option was accepting the buyout. Harrison opened his mouth to scream another threat, but before a single sound could escape his throat, the heavy oak doors at the back of the boardroom swung open with a loud, resounding thud. Every head in the room turned simultaneously toward the entrance. Tessa rolled her wheelchair straight into the center of the corporate arena. She was not the frail, weeping victim her family had spent 5 years pretending she was. She was dressed in a pristine, custom-tailored navy blue power suit that radiated absolute authority. Her posture was uncompromisingly straight, her expression forged from cold, hardened steel. She moved with a smooth, calculated precision, steering her chair directly toward the polished mahogany table. She did not look at the shareholders. She did not look at the tech conglomerate attorneys. She locked her gaze entirely on the 3 people sitting at the head of the table. The visual impact of her arrival sent a physical shockwave through the room. Linda gasped out loud, her perfectly manicured hand flying to her throat as if she had just seen a ghost. Her carefully constructed mask of high society indifference instantly shattered, replaced by naked, unadulterated shock. Cameron physically recoiled in his chair, his eyes widening in absolute terror. He grabbed the edge of the table, his knuckles white, his chest heaving as he stared at his sister. He looked like a man standing on the gallows watching the executioner place the noose around his neck. He knew exactly why she was here. He knew she had seen the photograph. Harrison completely lost his mind. The final frayed thread of his sanity snapped. His face contorted into a mask of pure, unrestrained rage. He lunged forward, nearly knocking his heavy leather chair backward onto the floor. He pointed a shaking finger at his daughter, spit flying from his lips as he screamed at the top of his lungs. He demanded to know how she had bypassed building security. He bellowed that this was a private, highly classified corporate meeting and that she had absolutely no legal right to be on the premises. He called her a trespassing cripple, his voice echoing violently off the glass walls. He ordered her to turn her chair around and leave the building immediately before he had her forcefully removed and thrown into the back of a police cruiser. He ranted that she was mentally unstable, that she was having a psychotic episode, and that nobody in the room should listen to a single word she had to say. He looked frantically toward the boardroom doors, screaming for the building security team to get in there and drag her out into the street. Two massive, broad-shouldered security guards stepped through the heavy oak doors, their faces completely impassive. Harrison smiled a wicked, triumphant smile, fully expecting them to grab his daughter's wheelchair and violently eject her from the premises. Instead, the guards marched directly past Harrison's seat. They did not move toward Tessa to remove her. They stepped up right behind her wheelchair, crossing their muscular arms, flanking her protectively, like two immovable human shields. Harrison's triumphant smile instantly vanished, his jaw dropping open in utter helpless disbelief as he stared at the men he paid to protect him. From the hallway behind the guards, an impeccably dressed man strode confidently into the corporate boardroom. It was Arthur Bennett, a senior partner at the most ruthless, feared corporate litigation firm in the entire city. Bennett did not utter a single word to Harrison. He simply walked straight up to the exact center of the polished mahogany table, smiled a razor-thin smile at the terrified Caldwell family, and dropped a massive, impossibly thick stack of black legal binders directly onto the wood. Arthur Bennett stood at the head of the mahogany table, his presence commanding absolute silence. He smoothed the lapels of his custom suit, ignoring my father's red-faced sputtering. Harrison demanded to know what a corporate litigator was doing invading a closed board meeting with an uninvited, estranged family member. Bennett calmly opened the thickest of the black legal binders and extracted a single sheet of watermarked paper. He placed it directly in front of the senior shareholder. He announced to the stunned room that I was not a trespasser, nor was I having a psychotic episode. He formally introduced me as the lead forensic investigator and the chief financial proxy holder for the international tech conglomerate that had initiated the hostile takeover. The collective gasp that rippled around the oval table sucked the remaining oxygen from the room. Linda gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles stark white, her mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. Cameron shrank into his chair, his bloodshot eyes wide with a feral, trapped terror. He finally understood that the photograph he received was not a random threat, but a targeted opening strike. Harrison stared at Bennett, his mind completely failing to process the impossible reality. He stammered that it was a mistake, that his daughter was merely a mid-level accountant who managed small portfolios from her home office. Bennett offered a cold, razor-thin smile and clarified that I was an elite forensic specialist who had personally audited Oakhaven Logistics over the past 72 hours. He stated that I now legally represented the entity that owned 78% of Oakhaven's secured commercial debt. I held the absolute power to liquidate the company, and I did not need a single vote from the seated board members to execute that right. I wheeled myself forward, positioning my chair directly opposite my father. The two security guards moved seamlessly with me, stepping back only to allow me access to the main projection console built into the table. I connected my secure tablet to the boardroom display system. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of the blistering rage that had fueled me for 5 years. I operated with the icy mechanical precision of an executioner who had already sharpened the blade. I tapped my screen, and the main projector hummed to life. The fabricated financial charts my father had proudly displayed only minutes earlier instantly vanished. They were replaced by a dense, undeniable matrix of raw, unedited data. I projected the true catastrophic financial state of Oakhaven Logistics onto the massive screen. I highlighted the massive deficits hidden beneath layers of shell companies and fraudulent offshore subsidiaries. I displayed the staggering commercial debt that Harrison had personally guaranteed using corporate assets he did not actually possess. The senior directors leaned forward, their eyes scanning the glowing red numbers, their murmurs of confusion rapidly transforming into exclamations of genuine horror. I pulled up internal ledgers, bypassing the heavily doctored reports Harrison had fed them for years. I showed them exactly how he had artificially inflated quarterly earnings by shifting phantom capital between ghost accounts. I laid out the systematic, relentless embezzlement that had drained the company's operational reserves dry. My father had been treating Oakhaven Logistics like his own personal piggy bank, siphoning off millions to fund his extravagant lifestyle, Linda's country club charity galas, and Cameron's endless trail of expensive legal settlements. The board members were looking at a corporate corpse. The company they had invested their lives and fortunes into was entirely worthless. The visual evidence on the screen was absolutely undeniable. I brought up the offshore holding companies Harrison had registered under fake corporate entities in the Cayman Islands. I traced the money from Oak Haven's employee pension fund directly into those hidden accounts. The shareholders watched their own retirement savings evaporate before their very eyes. One of the regional directors, a woman who had trusted Harrison for 15 years, buried her face in her hands and began to quietly sob. Another board member threw his pen across the room, cursing loudly at the betrayal. The tech conglomerate attorneys sat perfectly still, observing the carnage with cold, detached professionalism. They already knew the data. They had seen my preliminary reports. They were simply here to witness the execution. I did not stop. I displayed the fraudulent invoices, the manipulated vendor contracts, and the fake marketing expenses used to fund Cameron's lavish vacations. Every single dark, twisted secret of the Caldwell family was laid bare under the unforgiving fluorescent lights of the corporate boardroom. I moved to the next slide, mercilessly highlighting the specific dates and amounts of Harrison's illegal withdrawals. I showed the board the exact transaction where Harrison attempted to illegally liquidate my medical trust fund just yesterday afternoon, a desperate final theft blocked by the federal injunction my team had triggered. A senior shareholder, a man who had played golf with my father for 20 years, slammed his hands onto the table and demanded an explanation. He looked at Harrison with absolute disgust, asking how he could possibly lie to their faces while actively bankrupting the company. Harrison opened his mouth, but only a pathetic, raspy sound emerged. The invincible corporate titan was completely gone. In his place sat an exposed, terrified fraud. The reality of his complete financial ruin was crashing down on him in real time. The tech conglomerate did not want to merge with Oak Haven Logistics. They had purchased the debt specifically to dismantle the company, seize its regional infrastructure, and discard the rotting carcass. And I was the architect of that destruction. I continued the presentation, showing the board the precise terms of the hostile takeover. The payout would cover the outstanding commercial loans, leaving exactly zero equity for the shareholders. Their stock was effectively nullified. The outrage in the room reached a boiling point. Directors were shouting, demanding legal action, threatening my father with federal prison for fiduciary negligence. Bennett stood silently beside me, radiating an aura of untouchable legal authority, ensuring nobody stepped toward my chair. I simply watched my family drown. Linda was quietly weeping, her carefully applied makeup running down her face in dark streaks, mourning the instant death of her social status. Cameron looked like he was going to be physically sick, rocking back and forth in his leather chair, entirely broken by the sheer scale of the disaster. Cameron could no longer breathe. He desperately clawed at his expensive silk tie, ripping it loose from his collar as a suffocating panic attack finally overtook his cowardly heart. He whimpered like an animal, violently shoving his chair away from the table, as if trying to flee the visual proof of his immense guilt. Beside him, Linda suddenly stood up, her entire body trembling. She pointed a manicured finger at me, opening her mouth to scream one final insult, but her voice failed entirely. She collapsed into her chair, defeated. The chaos in the boardroom swirled around us, but Harrison only had eyes for me. The arrogant, abusive patriarch who had spent his entire life valuing wealth over human life was watching his empire burn to ashes. He realized that all his expensive lawyers, his corrupt politicians, and his corporate intimidation tactics were utterly useless against the crushing weight of undeniable financial truth. His power was gone. His legacy was obliterated. The sheer psychological shock caused his knees to buckle. He stumbled out from behind his chair and practically crawled around the edge of the mahogany table. The room abruptly fell dead silent as the mighty Harrison Caldwell dropped to his knees on the carpeted floor directly in front of my wheelchair. He reached out with trembling, sweaty hands, desperately grabbing the armrests of my chair. He looked up at me, his eyes bloodshot and overflowing with panicked tears. He begged me. The man who had mocked my paralysis, who had actively tried to cut off my medical care just days ago, was sobbing like a terrified child. He pleaded with me to stop the takeover. He begged me to show mercy, to remember that we were family, to save the Caldwell legacy from total annihilation. He swore he would change. He promised to give me absolute control of the board, to fire Cameron, to grant me whatever I wanted if I would just use my proxy power to restructure the debt and keep the company alive. He offered me everything he had, left a desperate, pathetic attempt to buy his way out of hell. I looked down at the pathetic, sobbing shell of the man who had orchestrated the darkest cover-up of my life. I felt absolutely no pity, no hesitation, and no mercy. I stared into his terrified eyes, my voice echoing clearly through the silent, captivated boardroom. I am not here to save your legacy. I am here to liquidate it, to pay for the crimes committed on May 14th. The echo of my words hung in the suffocating silence of the corporate boardroom, like the final strike of an executioner's bell. Harrison remained frozen on his knees, his hands weakly slipping from the armrests of my wheelchair. He stared up at me with hollow, uncomprehending eyes, his mind entirely incapable of grasping that the helpless, paralyzed daughter he had casually thrown away was now the absolute architect of his destruction. The lead attorney for the international tech conglomerate did not waste a single second indulging my father's pathetic breakdown. She stood up, smoothing her impeccable gray suit, and turned directly to the senior regional director sitting to her left. She stated with cold, unyielding precision that the conglomerate, acting as the newly established primary creditor of Oakhaven Logistics, required immediate corporate restructuring to protect their assets from further criminal plundering. The senior director, a man who had vacationed with Harrison for 2 decades and previously defended his every move, did not hesitate. He looked down at the weeping, shattered man on the floor with an expression of profound, unadulterated revulsion. He slammed his palm against the mahogany table and formally called for an emergency binding vote to immediately terminate Harrison Caldwell from his position as Chief Executive Officer and to terminate Cameron Caldwell from his position as Vice President of Operations. The motion was seconded before the echo of the proposal even faded. The vote moved around the massive oval table with ruthless, blinding speed. Every single board member, every regional vice president, and every senior shareholder raised their hand in unanimous, uncompromising agreement. Not a single voice spoke in defense of the Caldwell family. Arthur Bennett stepped forward, his leather shoes silent against the thick carpet, and placed a secondary legal document onto the table. He informed the board that because the termination was explicitly executed for cause, specifically citing massive fiduciary negligence, corporate fraud, and federal embezzlement, every single protective clause in the Caldwell employment contracts was instantly rendered null and void. There would be no golden parachutes. There would be no transitional consulting fees. The luxurious multi-million-dollar severance packages that Harrison and Cameron had written into their own contracts were completely dissolved. Furthermore, Bennett clarified that the termination instantly stripped them of all corporate legal indemnification. Oakhaven Logistics would no longer cover a single penny of their mounting defense fees. They were entirely on their own, facing federal prosecution with absolutely zero financial shielding. Harrison released a low, agonizing groan, collapsing completely onto the floor as the weight of his total, inescapable ruin finally crushed him. Just outside the primary boardroom, separated only by a wall of thick, soundproofed architectural glass, Sophie stood in the executive gallery. Cameron's breathtakingly beautiful status-obsessed fiancé had arrived an hour earlier, fully expecting to attend a lavish, catered celebratory luncheon following the successful merger. She was wearing a stunning, custom-tailored designer dress, holding a glass of imported sparkling water, anticipating a day of high society triumphs. Instead, she had watched the entire catastrophic disaster unfold in real time through the transparent glass walls. She possessed a sharp, ruthlessly calculating survival instinct, finely honed by years of manipulating wealthy men. As she watched Harrison weeping on the carpet and saw the undeniable financial data projected onto the massive screen, she instantly understood the reality of the situation. The Caldwell family fortune was a complete mirage. The luxury estates, the private jets, the offshore accounts, all of it was locked down by a federal injunction and destined to be seized by the government. She looked at Cameron, who was currently slumped in his chair, hyperventilating and weeping uncontrollably, and she felt absolutely nothing but cold, self-preserving disgust. He was not a corporate prince. He was a broke, terrified criminal who was imminently headed to a federal penitentiary. Sophie did not rush into the boardroom to comfort her trembling fiancé. She did not shed a single tear for the destruction of her impending marriage. She slowly backed away from the glass wall, retreating into the shadowed corner of the executive gallery. She pulled her smartphone from her designer clutch, her perfectly manicured fingers flying across the screen with practiced lightning speed. Following Cameron's highly publicized arrest for the vehicular assault, Linda had aggressively utilized her social connections to establish a massive online legal defense and support fund for her golden boy. The digital account had accumulated hundreds of thousands of dollars from wealthy, misinformed sympathizers. Because Sophie had volunteered to manage the wedding finances, she possessed the master administrative passwords to every single one of Cameron's secondary digital accounts. With cold, mechanical precision, she logged into the primary crowdfunding portal. She bypassed the security protocols and initiated an immediate expedited wire transfer, funneling every single dollar of the donated cash directly into her own private, untraceable offshore banking account. The loading icon spun for a fraction of a second before flashing a green confirmation checkmark. She then opened her messaging application and typed a brief, completely emotionless text message to Cameron. "It is over. Do not contact me." She hit send, turned on her stiletto heels, and walked out of the Oakhaven Logistics headquarters without a single backward glance, heading straight for the international airport to flee the state forever. Inside the chaotic boardroom, Cameron's phone violently vibrated in his suit jacket pocket. He flinched, pulling the device out with slick, trembling hands. He stared at the glowing screen, his bloodshot eyes reading Sophie's brutal two-sentence message. The notification of the massive unauthorized withdrawal from the legal defense fund appeared immediately beneath her text. The final fragile pillar of his fabricated reality shattered into a million jagged pieces. He was entirely broke. His fiancée had robbed him and abandoned him. The board of directors had stripped him of his title and his income, and standing right in front of him, radiating cold, terrifying authority, was the sister he had tried to murder. He looked down at his father, who was still curled into a pathetic weeping ball on the floor. He looked at his mother, who was currently shrieking incoherently at the security guards demanding that they arrest Arthur Bennett. Then, Cameron looked past them both and saw Bennett holding his own cellular phone to his ear. He heard the senior attorney calmly instructing the federal authorities that the primary suspects in the Oakhaven embezzlement case were currently contained in the executive boardroom and ready for immediate apprehension. The police were coming. Federal agents were coming. They were going to drag him out of the building in handcuffs and lock him in a maximum security prison cell for the rest of his natural life. Pure, blind, animalistic panic completely hijacked Cameron's fragile nervous system. The survival instinct of a cornered coward overrode whatever minor shred of family loyalty he possessed. He did not care about his father's weeping or his mother's frantic screaming. He only cared about saving himself. He scrambled backward, his expensive leather shoes slipping wildly against the polished hardwood floor. He slammed into the heavy oak table, knocking over a crystal water pitcher before regaining his footing. Harrison weakly raised his head from the carpet, reaching out a trembling hand toward his golden boy. He rasped Cameron's name, begging his son to stay, begging him to face the board together and fight for their survival. Cameron did not even look back. He ignored his father's pathetic pleas entirely. He shoved a regional director out of his way, practically tearing the secondary emergency exit door off its heavy brass hinges, and sprinted out of the boardroom like a terrified, hunted rat. He bolted down the executive stairwell, bypassing the elevators entirely. his breath tearing through his lungs in ragged, desperate gasps. He burst out into the underground executive parking garage, the heavy steel security door slamming shut behind him, leaving his parents completely abandoned to face the brutal consequences of their collective crimes. Cameron reached his sleek imported sports car, fumbling wildly with his electronic key fob. He collapsed into the driver's seat, locking the doors and instantly starting the powerful engine. His mind raced frantically, cycling through his rapidly dwindling options. He knew his passport was likely flagged. He knew his bank accounts, his credit cards, and his investment portfolios were all entirely frozen by the federal injunction. He needed massive amounts of untraceable liquid cash to secure a fake identity and disappear across the international border before the authorities issued a mandatory warrant for his arrest. He pounded his fists against the leather steering wheel, his mind desperately searching for a vulnerability. Then, a dark, dangerous realization surfaced in his panicked brain. During a careless conversation years ago, Harrison had complained about the extreme security measures utilized by elite forensic accounting firms. He had specifically mentioned that firms dealing in high-level corporate acquisitions and international wealth management often held physical unregistered bearer bonds in highly fortified on-site safes for their most demanding, secretive international clients. Cameron realized that Tessa was the lead forensic investigator for a massive international tech conglomerate. He convinced himself, driven by absolute blinding desperation, that she must possess millions in untraceable bearer bonds locked away in her private downtown office. As midnight approached, plunging the city into deep freezing shadows, Cameron parked his car 2 blocks away from the towering glass headquarters of Tessa's accounting firm. He pulled the hood of a dark sweatshirt over his head, shivering violently from a toxic combination of alcohol withdrawal and overwhelming psychological terror. He reached into the trunk of his car and pulled out a heavy, solid steel crowbar. He gripped the cold metal in his sweating hands, feeling the heavy weight of the steel against his palms. He moved toward the reinforced glass doors of the towering building, his eyes darting frantically to check for security cameras and wandering night guards. He was no longer an arrogant, wealthy corporate vice president. He had officially crossed the ultimate degrading line, entirely reduced to a desperate common burglar, fully intending to shatter the glass break into his paralyzed sister's highly secure vault and steal his way to a permanent, untraceable freedom before the rising sun illuminated his total destruction. Cameron swung the heavy steel crowbar against the reinforced glass doors of the accounting firm, the shattering crash echoing through the deserted downtown street. He scrambled through the jagged opening, tearing his expensive suit jacket and slicing his arm completely numb to the physical pain. He navigated the darkened corridors purely by memory of the architectural blueprints he had frantically pulled up on his phone. He reached the primary document vault, swinging the crowbar wildly at the electronic keypad until the plastic casing shattered, exposing the wiring. He ripped the wires out, bypassing the magnetic lock through sheer brute force. He pulled the heavy steel door open, expecting to find rows of untraceable bearer bonds stacked neatly on the reinforced metal shelves. Instead, the vault was entirely empty, save for a single brightly illuminated tablet resting on a steel pedestal in the center of the room. Cameron stumbled forward, his breath hitching as the screen flared to life. It displayed a live high-definition video feed of himself covered in sweat and blood, holding a crowbar inside a federal financial vault. The wail of approaching police sirens instantly pierced the quiet night air, echoing through the empty city blocks. Tessa had anticipated his cowardly desperation entirely. She watched the entire pathetic spectacle unfold from the secure monitors in her downtown penthouse, sipping a cup of black coffee, as heavily armed police officers stormed the vault and tackled her screaming brother to the ground with brutal efficiency. The following morning, the sun rose over a completely altered reality for the Caldwell family. Harrison was in federal custody, denied bail due to the overwhelming evidence of his extreme flight risk. Cameron was sitting in a maximum security holding cell facing dozens of charges ranging from corporate embezzlement to armed burglary and destruction of federal property. The corporate empire was in the process of being aggressively liquidated. Tessa sat in her spacious, sunlit penthouse living room, finalizing the digital transfer protocols for the hostile takeover when the private elevator chimed unexpectedly. The heavy steel doors slid open, revealing a sight that Tessa had never expected to witness in her entire lifetime. Linda stepped into the foyer. She was completely unrecognizable. The immaculate, perfectly tailored society matron who had terrorized the local country club for decades was gone. Her designer dress was wrinkled and stained with dirt. Her hair, usually sprayed into a rigid, flawless helmet, hung limply around her pale, unwashed face. Her expensive jewelry had been pawned or confiscated, leaving her neck and wrists bare and vulnerable. She looked entirely hollowed out, stripped of her immense wealth, her unearned social standing, and her toxic arrogance. Linda practically collapsed against the edge of the entryway console, her hands trembling violently as she looked across the room at the daughter she had thrown away 5 years ago. Tessa did not move from her wheelchair. She simply folded her hands in her lap and waited, allowing the suffocating silence to stretch out and break her mother's fragile nerves. Linda took a hesitant step forward, tears welling in her eyes. They were not the manufactured theatrical tears she usually deployed to manipulate country club committees or extract sympathy from wealthy donors. These tears were born of genuine, absolute terror and sudden realization of her impending downfall. She fell to her knees on the expensive hardwood floor, crawling the last few feet toward Tessa's wheelchair. She grabbed the edge of the armrests, bowing her head as violent sobs racked her trembling body. She begged Tessa to stop the legal proceedings immediately. She pleaded with her to call off the forensic accountants, to drop the federal charges, and to let her husband and son come home without facing any prison time. She claimed that the family had suffered enough, that the utter public humiliation and the total loss of the Oakhaven Corporation were already a sufficient punishment for whatever minor slights Tessa believed she had endured. Linda promised that if Tessa would just release a fraction of the frozen funds, they could move away, start over quietly in another state, and finally be a real loving family. She reached out to touch Tessa's knee, desperately trying to invoke a maternal bond that had never actually existed. Tessa looked down at her mother with an expression of profound, chilling emptiness. She smoothly reversed her wheelchair, forcing Linda's hands to slip off the armrests and drop onto the floor. "You are asking me to halt a federal investigation into criminal embezzlement," Tessa stated, her voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotion. "You are asking me to excuse decades of systemic fraud because you do not want to lose your summer homes and your luxury vehicles." Linda shook her head frantically, her voice rising in pitch as panic overrode her logic. She desperately attempted to twist the narrative, slipping naturally back into her lifelong habit of aggressive gaslighting techniques. She claimed that Harrison only took that money to provide a better life for all of them. She insisted that they were victims of a ruthless corporate culture that demanded impossible financial results. She looked up at Tessa, her face twisted in a mask of agonizing desperation, and tried to play her ultimate card. She claimed that every single thing they did, every lie they told, was solely meant to protect the family unit from being destroyed by outside forces. Tessa leaned forward, her eyes narrowing into cold, unforgiving slits. She demanded to know exactly what kind of family unit required covering up a horrific, near-fatal car crash and framing an innocent daughter. The pressure finally shattered Linda's mental defenses. In her frantic, blind desperation to justify her toxic existence, she accidentally confessed. She threw her hands into the air, tears streaming down her face, and screamed at the top of her lungs. "We had to protect Cameron. We had to protect the family name. It was for your own good." The words hung in the quiet penthouse, a damning, irrefutable admission of absolute guilt. Linda immediately clamped her hands over her mouth, her eyes widening in horror as she realized exactly what she had just screamed into the open room. She tried to backtrack, stuttering meaningless apologies, claiming she misspoke out of sheer exhaustion. Tessa simply reached out for the sleek smart home console resting on the glass coffee table. She tapped a single button. The high-fidelity surround sound speakers embedded in the penthouse ceiling instantly came to life. The crystal-clear, digitally remastered audio recording from Cameron's lavish engagement party filled the room. Linda was forced to sit on the floor and listen to her own cruel, mocking voice echoing off the walls. She heard herself laughing with Sophie's mother. She heard herself expressing profound, venomous disgust at the mere thought of her paralyzed daughter attending the wedding and ruining the aesthetic of the photographs. She heard herself calling Tessa a pathetic, useless cripple who deserved to be locked away in a cheap rehabilitation facility out of sight. The audio recording played in its absolute entirety, completely dismantling any remaining illusion of maternal love or familial loyalty in the room. Tessa turned off the audio, leaving a heavy, lethal silence in its wake. She looked down at the weeping, ruined woman on the floor. "You protected an asset, not a family. Now you have nothing." Linda collapsed entirely, pressing her face against the hardwood floor, her body shaking with uncontrolled, agonizing sobs. She realized that her lifelong campaign of manipulation, deceit, and cruelty had finally met an immovable force. There was no remaining leverage. There was no secret loophole she could exploit. The wealth, the status, the country club memberships, and the sprawling estates were completely gone. She was staring down the barrel of total, inescapable destitution and impending federal indictment. She reached out one final time, her fingers brushing against the rubber tire of Tessa's wheelchair, begging for a single ounce of mercy from the child she had deliberately destroyed. Tessa did not flinch. She did not offer a single word of comfort. She simply raised her right hand and pointed a perfectly manicured finger toward the sleek black smart home console sitting on the coffee table. A small, bright red indicator light was pulsing steadily on the corner of the device. Linda stared at the glowing red dot, her tear-streaked face freezing in absolute, unadulterated terror as the horrifying reality set in. Tessa looked down at her mother, her voice dropping to a low, chilling whisper that severed the final chord of the Caldwell family legacy forever. She informed her mother that the entire confession, the explicit admission of covering up the vehicular assault to protect Cameron and the family name, was not a private conversation. It was just streamed directly to the district attorney's office downtown, ensuring that every single word she had just spoken was officially recorded into the permanent public record as undeniable criminal evidence against the entire corrupted Caldwell family. Cameron swung the heavy steel crowbar against the reinforced glass doors of the executive accounting suite, the deafening shatter echoing through the deserted, cavernous hallway of the downtown high-rise. He scrambled blindly through the jagged opening, catching the sleeve of his expensive tailored suit jacket on a sharp shard of glass. The fabric tore with a loud rip, and the jagged edge sliced a deep burning gash across his forearm, but Cameron was entirely numb to the physical pain. He was running purely on adrenaline-blind panic and the toxic chemical residue of severe alcohol withdrawal. His breath tore through his burning lungs in ragged, desperate gasps as he navigated the pitch-black corridors, relying entirely on the faint, ambient glow of the city skyline filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. He knew exactly where he was going. He had studied the architectural blueprints he had frantically downloaded to his phone during his manic drive downtown. He burst into Tessa's private corner office, plunging into the darkness like a starving feral animal hunting for its last meal. He was convinced that the physical bearer bonds, millions of dollars in untraceable liquid cash, were hidden somewhere in this room. He just needed to find the safe, crack it open, and secure his permanent escape before the federal authorities realized he had fled the corporate boardroom. He began tearing the immaculate office apart with violent, uncontrolled physical aggression. He swept his bleeding arm across her polished mahogany desk, sending expensive monitors, crystal paperweights, and stacked forensic files crashing onto the hardwood floor. He ripped open filing cabinets, hurling handfuls of confidential corporate documents into the air, creating a chaotic blizzard of white paper in the dark room. He kicked over leather guest chairs and blindly smashed his crowbar into the drywall, hunting for a hollow echo that would reveal a hidden compartment. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes, and mixing with the blood dripping from his lacerated arm. He was whimpering, a pathetic high-pitched sound of absolute terror that vibrated in the back of his throat. Every shadow in the room looked like a federal agent. Every distant siren echoing up from the city streets sounded like his impending arrest. Finally, he noticed a heavy, modern painting hanging slightly askew on the far wall. He ripped the canvas down, tossing it carelessly aside to reveal the dull metallic gleam of a flush-mounted wall safe. A guttural cry of desperate triumph erupted from Cameron's chest. He gripped the cold steel of the crowbar with both sweating hands, wedging the flattened curved edge into the microscopic seam between the safe door and the reinforced wall. He threw his entire body weight against the heavy iron tool, grunting and straining, as he tried to forcibly pry the impenetrable lock mechanism apart. The metal groaned and shrieked under the immense pressure, but the heavy vault door remained absolutely unyielding. He struck the digital keypad repeatedly with the blunt end of the crowbar, smashing the plastic casing into a shower of useless electrical sparks and broken plastic, entirely convinced that brute force could overcome elite corporate security. He was completely unhinged, acting entirely on the primal, degrading instinct of a cornered coward who had run out of lies, run out of money, and run out of time. Suddenly, the deafening mechanical thrum of the master breaker switch engaging echoed through the suite. A fraction of a second later, the overhead fluorescent lights snapped on with blinding, unforgiving intensity. Cameron violently flinched, dropping the heavy steel crowbar onto the floor with a loud ringing clatter. He threw his bloody hands up to shield his eyes from the sudden agonizing glare. He spun around his chest, heaving his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. As his pupils rapidly adjusted to the harsh white light, the breath completely evaporated from his lungs. He was not alone in the destroyed office. Tessa was waiting for him. She sat perfectly motionless behind her massive polished mahogany desk, exactly where she had been waiting in the pitch-black silence the entire time. She was not in her penthouse dealing with their mother. She had perfectly anticipated his cowardice, calculating his exact desperate trajectory with the ruthless precision of a grandmaster moving a pawn across a chessboard. She wore a dark, immaculate power suit, her hands calmly folded, resting on the leather desk pad. She looked utterly untouched by the chaos he had just unleashed, a picture of absolute chilling composure amidst the wreckage of his frantic burglary. The visual contrast between them was stark and absolute. Cameron was bleeding, sweating, and trembling like a hunted animal. Tessa was a stone monument of lethal, unshakable authority. For 3 agonizing seconds, Cameron simply stared at his sister, his mind entirely incapable of processing the reality of his entrapment. Then the final fragile psychological barrier holding his sanity together completely disintegrated. The charming, untouchable golden child facade he had worn for 32 years melted away, exposing the ugly, terrified, and profoundly weak monster hiding underneath. He realized he was not going to escape. He realized she had outsmarted him at every single turn. A primal, ear-splitting scream of pure hatred tore from Cameron's throat. He lunged forward, slamming his bloody hands onto the edge of her desk looming over her wheelchair with unrestrained, violent aggression. He demanded to know why she could not just stay broken. He screamed that she was supposed to be the helpless, paralyzed victim quietly fading away in a rehabilitation facility while he inherited the world. He unleashed years of toxic, repressed resentment, his voice cracking and breaking as he spit out his absolute disgust for her. He confessed that he had always hated her. He hated her because she was naturally brilliant. He hated her because she never had to try, because she effortlessly mastered every academic and corporate challenge, while he had to cheat, bribe, and manipulate his way through life just to maintain the illusion of competence. She was the one who actually deserved the Caldwell legacy, and her very existence was a constant, humiliating reminder of his own profound mediocrity. He did not stop. Driven by a psychotic need to hurt her one last time before his life ended, he explicitly confessed to the darkest, most unforgivable secret of his miserable existence. He screamed about the night of May 14th. He admitted, his voice echoing violently off the glass walls, that he was blackout drunk when he grabbed the keys to her car. He confessed that he was driving at over 90 miles an hour, his vision completely blurred by alcohol and reckless arrogance when he lost control on the wet pavement. He described the deafening crunch of metal, the explosive force of the airbags, and the terrifying realization that he had plowed her vehicle directly into a massive, unyielding oak tree. Cameron leaned closer, his face inches from hers, a sick, twisted smile forming on his lips as he recounted the aftermath. He told her that he woke up tasting his own blood relatively unharmed, but instantly paralyzed by the terrifying realization that a DUI conviction would completely destroy his golden future. He looked over and saw her unconscious, her body broken and bleeding. He admitted that in that crucial split second of moral reckoning, he felt absolutely no remorse and no protective instinct. He only felt an overwhelming, consuming desire to save himself at any cost. He confessed with graphic, horrifying detail exactly how he had unbuckled his seatbelt, grabbed her limp, unconscious body, and dragged her violently across the center console. He explicitly detailed how he shoved her into the driver's seat, manipulating the scene of the crime to frame her for the catastrophic crash. He screamed that he left her there paralyzed, bleeding, and trapped in the mangled steel, deliberately abandoning her to take the fall because he simply could not stomach the thought of ruining his own perfect, privileged life. He justified his monstrous actions, shouting that he was the heir to the empire, that his life was inherently more valuable than hers, and that she was merely an expendable asset sacrificed to protect the Caldwell family name. Throughout his entire unhinged, screaming confession, Tessa did not flinch. She did not yell back. She did not shed a single tear. She sat perfectly still, her face an unreadable mask of absolute terrifying calm. She allowed him to empty his toxic soul, watching him hang himself with his own words. She looked at his red, sweating face, absorbing the absolute depth of his depravity without a single ounce of surprise. She had known the truth for 5 years, but hearing him scream it out loud was the final necessary closure. When Cameron finally ran out of breath, his chest heaving as he stared down at her with wide, manic eyes, Tessa simply tilted her head. She did not offer a grand monologue. She did not explain how she had systematically dismantled his life. She merely raised her right hand and pressed a small, discreet silver button mounted beneath the polished rim of her mahogany desk. The response was instantaneous and deafening. The heavy, reinforced oak doors of the executive office burst open with an explosive crash. A highly tactical, heavily armed SWAT team poured into the room with terrifying speed and coordinated, ruthless precision. The officers fanned out their heavy combat boots, pounding against the hardwood floor. Dozens of glowing red laser sights instantly cut through the bright air, converging directly onto Cameron's chest. He froze, his hands still resting on Tessa's desk, his eyes widening in absolute paralyzing horror as the officers screamed commands, fully armed and ready to execute the final takedown of the Golden Boy. The devastating downfall of the Caldwell family serves as a powerful reminder that an empire built on deception, manipulation, and the sacrifice of others will inevitably collapse under its own toxic weight. Harrison and Linda Caldwell chose to worship the illusion of their perfect, untouchable legacy. They elevated Cameron as the absolute golden child, constantly shielding him from the consequences of his own destructive actions, while casually discarding Tessa the moment she became an inconvenience to their carefully curated public image. Their ultimate ruin was not merely a financial collapse. It was a moral bankruptcy. They believed that wealth and status granted them immunity from the truth. However, Tessa's journey teaches us a profound lesson about the true nature of power and resilience. She demonstrated that you do not owe loyalty to bloodlines that view you as an expendable asset. Genuine strength does not come from unearned privilege or societal status. It is forged in the fires of betrayal and honed through calculated, unwavering patience. Tessa survived the darkest betrayal imaginable, not by seeking their impossible approval, but by embracing absolute radical independence. She severed the toxic bonds of her abusers and methodically dismantled their empire, using the very truth they desperately tried to bury. The Caldwells lost everything because they furiously protected a lie. Tessa gained the world because she weaponized the truth. She proved that sometimes the ultimate form of self-care is becoming the architect of your own justice. Have you ever had to draw an iron boundary to protect your peace and sanity from toxic family dynamics? Share your own story of reclaiming your power and defining your own worth in the comments below. If Tessa's journey to absolute vindication resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe for more stories of ultimate survival and sweet revenge.